The period between the First and Second World Wars, between the vehement agitation for the vote and the social convulsions of the 60s, is often thought to have been a time of relative quiet for organized feminism. But the quiet is an illusion. In fact, the interwar period was a time of intense activism, as feminist leaders inaugurated the pivotal next phase of the feminist movement, which involved the ideological capture of international and non-governmental organizations, none more so than the League of Nations. I'm Janice Fiamengo, and this is the Fiamengo File 2.0. Feminism was always to some extent international. In the 19th century, English-speaking feminist activists often crisscrossed the Atlantic to share ideas and strategies. They held conferences and hosted speakers throughout North America, Great Britain, and Western Europe. But it was in the period after the First World War that feminism became an extensively international phenomenon, one of its primary goals being to create binding international agreements regarding the status of women. Ultimately, the aim of this international activism was to develop a politics above politics, one that would control decision-making at the national level, regardless of which national political party was elected or what the citizens of individual countries actually preferred and voted for. Using the language of universal rights, feminists such as the American activist Alice Paul, leader of the National Woman's Party, and British socialist, pacifist, and feminist Vera Brittain set their sights on transforming their societies by changing the very manner in which the world order was envisioned and implemented. It is now generally recognized that the United Nations is aggressively feminist, with a huge wing focused on empowering women and girls with massively expensive international programs justified by ever more bizarre, unprovable claims about women and girls being the primary victims of climate change, for example, or about how, quote, achieving full gender equality is still centuries away, end quote, as a recent hysterical press release declared. But even before the United Nations, which was founded in 1945, feminism was part of the international order through the League of Nations, an organization begun in 1920 with 42 member nations and predecessor to the UN. A glimpse into the operation of the League provides an excellent example of how feminists laid the groundwork for their global institutional power later in the century. Though the League of Nations was created specifically to protect member states' security interests and to prevent another war, it became much more than that, embracing various social reform initiatives. Ethics and human rights professor Regula Ludi has argued in a recent article for the Journal of Women's History that feminist organizations were active in the League of Nations from the time of its creation, lobbying for the adoption of international legal standards that would increase pressure on reluctant governments and would contribute to what she calls, quote, technocratic internationalism, end quote, or global rule by experts. Feminists early on positioned themselves as experts on all issues related to women, children, peace, and social progress. Their rationale was from the beginning, which built on decades of feminist propaganda from the 19th century, that women could offer a unique alternative model of international relations that would allegedly substitute cooperation for competition because women were more cooperative and less warlike than men. One of the many feminist groups involved with the League was the International Council of Women. This was an influential umbrella organization established back in 1888 with founding members including some we know well here at Studio B, especially suffrage leaders Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and the leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Frances Willard. At best, these activists believed that women were morally superior to men and could, if only given the opportunity, organize society on a far more just and compassionate basis than men had ever achieved or even cared to try. At worst, they believed that men were barely human, willful oppressors who should be excluded from most of the world's decision-making and in need of re-education and social control. The website of the International Council of Women, or ICW, today boldly declares its female supremacism, including its belief in female moral superiority. It states grandly that, quote, ICW work is not limited to reducing political, economic, and civil inequities, but encompasses a moralization of the world so that it can be transformed into a good place for all women and children to live. ICW firmly believes that there is an ideal situation of well-being, happiness, and social justice that is common to all women, irrespective of social class, ethnicity, or religion, end quote. One cannot help but notice how even while declaring that only women can bring about this, quote, moralization of the world, these deeply caring women deliberately exclude men from their mention of those who deserve a good place to live. And this is obviously no accident. To the feminists of the ICW, men have never had a conception of morality and have never cared to protect or provide for women and children. The ICW's further strange assertion that all women will agree about the, quote, ideal situation of well-being, happiness, and justice is deeply naive at best, dangerously totalitarian more likely. Organizations like the ICW and many others, including the notable British 6 Points group, which was founded in 1921 to advance women's political goals, continually lobbied diplomats and representatives at the League of Nations to ensure feminist representation on all of its various advisory committees. These groups were successful in influencing international policy, especially on such matters as child welfare, women workers' rights, and women's legal status within marriage. And they did so primarily by producing reports for the League and defining issues in explicitly feminist terms. And in particular, they stress concepts such as gender hierarchy and sex discrimination, encouraging League members to see women as a victim group distinct from men and globally oppressed. They stress that gender inequalities in nations were produced by patriarchal social structures and had never evolved naturally. Feminists also fought hard for what they called an equal rights treaty. This was something that would bind member nations to pursue feminist policies. According to feminist researcher Carol Miller in a detailed article on interwar feminist activism, the idea for an equal rights treaty was first proposed in 1926 by Lady Margaret Ronda, a Welsh peeress, former suffragette, and chair of the aforementioned British 6 Points group. Ronda gained the support of American activist Alice Paul, chair of the International Advisory Committee of the American National Woman's Party, and Paul began to mobilize support amongst other activists. And soon this treaty became a major feminist initiative. One League member remarked that, quote, every time one meets members of women's organizations, this question of some sort of equal rights treaty is brought up. Although some member nations resisted the idea, objecting that customary relations between men and women were inextricable from each nation's unique culture and shouldn't be subject to a sweeping universal rule. That perspective, though, quickly came to seem embarrassingly retrograde. One member of a feminist organization called Equal Rights International was happy to report that one felt very strongly at Geneva that few nations were prepared to oppose equality, end quote. Under pressure from feminists over the years, the League finally agreed in 1937 to conduct an international survey which would collect data on the legal, political, and economic status of women in preparation for a report on the status of women and recommendations for improvement. The committee in charge of the survey and the report to follow was staffed with a majority of feminist women, including French professor of law Suzanne Bastide, New York judge Dorothy Kenyon, Anka Godjevac, a Yugoslavian lawyer, and Kirsten Hesselgren, a Swedish MP. In retrospect, it seems remarkable that in the later 1930s, a time when diplomatic crises and deepening hostilities between nations were bringing world conflagration ever closer, the League should have agreed to divert resources and intellectual energy to a study of the status of women. Feminists had been so successful in convincing the League that women's issues were inextricable from the League's main business of promoting international security. The feminist methodology at the League seemed to operate on the following quite brilliant question: why work to convince a nation to carry out your ideological demands through the give-and-take contest of the democratic process when you could simply persuade some unelected technocrats to impose your worldview? Carol Miller quotes Vera Brittain arguing that, quote, "The time has now come to move from the national to the international sphere and to endeavor to obtain by international agreement what national legislation has failed to accomplish," end quote. As Professor Ludi notes in her research, feminist activism at the international level was an important part of, quote, "the process by which certain political issues were displaced from the national and into the international realm." Feminists astutely recognized that pushing for international standards determined by feminist experts would concentrate power in the hands of a decision-making elite. In the end, the International Survey on the Status of Women was never completed, as League members eventually had to confront the cataclysm of the Second World War and, in effect, the failure of the organization whose main purpose had been to prevent another war. But although no binding equal rights treaty resulted from the investigations that were undertaken, the push for a global solution to feminist issues had definitely borne fruit. It was clear that by the end of the 1930s, a majority at the League of Nations had been convinced, or at least had decided to officially accept the feminist idea about women's oppression, and that all of the ideas stemming from that these ideas were not only legitimate, but were also intimately related to global security and development. And the effect was long-lasting. The feminist doctrine that oppression of women was universal and was caused by systemic inequities, that framed international discussions for the next century. Moreover, activism towards an equal rights treaty didn't end with the League. When the United Nations was formed in 1945, a Commission on the Status of Women was immediately created, and as Carol Miller explains, quote, "The scheme outlined by the League Committee of Experts and the material collected in the course of its inquiry provided the basis for the early activities of the UN Status of Women Commission," end quote. Later in the century, a comprehensive convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women was ratified in 1981. It contains 30 distinct provisions for advancing women's equality while also recognizing women's special needs and disabilities as women, needs which require special treatment to redress imbalances or eliminate wrongs. It thus commits ratifying states to a sweeping range of impossible to satisfy initiatives and promises, such as making sure women have access to abortion and, quote, maternity leave with pay, making sure women have the, quote, right to bank loans and the, quote, right to participate in recreational activities and sports, to name only a very few of the intrusive and endlessly expensive standards that must be complied with. The idea that men and women's needs are best served through a holistic approach that values men and women equally, is appropriate to each country's unique culture, and recognizes that men also have distinct needs and disabilities. That idea was decisively quashed by the acceptance of feminist dogma and has never been successfully rehabilitated. In short, feminist demands advanced at the League of Nations in the 1920s and 30s, cloaked in authoritative-seeming language and with a veneer of expert legitimacy, quickly became an integral part of decision-making at the highest international levels, thus assuring the emergence of global feminist power in the second half of the 20th century.